She arrived on a Tuesday, standing in the back of a wagon like something being delivered. Not a woman, not a person, just a number on a debt ledger that her father had signed away before the whiskey took the last of his judgment. Mara Kincaid stepped down from that wagon onto Jace Mallory's cracked dirt yard and looked at the man who now technically owned her labor, her time, and according to Ezekiel Varn's paperwork, the next 3 years of her life. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She looked at the broken fence line, the sagging barn roof, the exhausted furrow between Jace's brows, and she started counting. If you've ever been told your life belongs to someone else's debt, stay with me. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning they came for Mara, she was already awake. She'd been awake most of the night, actually, listening to her father move through the house with that particular shuffle he'd developed over the past year, the one that meant he'd gotten into the bottle again and was trying to navigate the dark without admitting it to himself. She heard him bump the kitchen table, curse low under his breath, then go quiet. After a while, she heard him settle into his chair by the cold stove and stay there. She lay on her cot in the small room off the back of the house and stared at the ceiling, and did what she always did when sleep wouldn't come. She counted things. How many weeks since the last good rain? How many head of cattle they'd had to sell off since spring? How many times Varn's man had ridden out to the property in the past 3 months? Each visit a little more pointed than the last. The language a little less courteous. The timeline a little more compressed. She'd gotten very good at counting over the years. It was the one thing that kept panic at a manageable distance, turning fear into numbers, turning numbers into problems, turning problems into something that might, theoretically, be solved. The problem she was lying there counting that particular night did not feel solvable. Her father, Clem Kincaid, had borrowed against the farm twice. The first time had been after her mother died and the medical debts came due. A reasonable thing, maybe, or at least an understandable one. The second time had been less reasonable and considerably less understandable, though Mara had only pieced together the full shape of it in fragments over the course of 2 years. Clem had gone to Varn's lending office looking to invest in a neighboring parcel that was rumored to be sitting on good water. The investment had gone nowhere. The debt had not. By the time Mara understood the terms her father had agreed to, the numbers had already grown past the point where working the farm harder could close the gap. The interest was structured in a way she'd never seen before. Not a flat rate, not even a graduated one, but something that shifted according to clauses buried deep in the contract, clauses that seemed designed to be missed, that only revealed their full weight when it was already too late to do anything about them. She'd sat with that contract for 3 evenings in a row, reading it by lamplight with a pencil in her hand, circling the language she didn't understand, underlining the terms that didn't match what her father described the agreement as being. When she finally brought it to him and laid it flat on the table and pointed to what she'd found, he'd looked at it for a long moment and then looked away. "It's fine," he'd said. "I'll work it down." He hadn't worked it down. Varn's men arrived just after sunrise, 2 of them riding into the yard with the unhurried confidence of people who already knew the outcome of the conversation they were about to have. Mara was feeding the chickens. She didn't stop when she heard them ride in. She finished what she was doing, set down the feed pail, wiped her hands on her skirt, and turned around. The one in front was a man named Aldous. She'd seen him before, at the lending office, at the county seat, hovering at the edges of various transactions like a pale and patient shadow. He had a lean, administrative quality to him, the look of someone who'd made a career out of delivering bad news in careful language. "Miss Kincaid," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and dismissive at the same time. "Your father inside?" "He's inside," she said. "You can talk to me." Aldous looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite surprise, but wasn't quite not surprise either. "I'd prefer to speak with Mr. Kincaid directly. The matter concerns him." "The matter concerns me," Mara said. "I've been managing the accounts for 2 years. Whatever you have to say about this property, you can say it to my face." There was a pause. Aldous glanced back at the second rider, a larger man whose name she didn't know and didn't particularly want to, and then back at her. Something shifted slightly in his expression, a very small recalibration. "As you like," he said, and reached into his coat for a folded document. He explained it in the measured, neutral tone of a man who'd explained similar things many times before. The debt had reached a threshold. The farm did not represent sufficient collateral to cover what was owed. Mr. Varn, being a reasonable man interested in equitable resolution, had arranged a transfer agreement with a neighboring rancher, a man named Mallory, out east of town, who had his own debt obligations with Varn's office and had agreed to absorb the Kincaid liability in exchange for a period of labor service from a member of the Kincaid household. Mara listened to all of this without changing her expression. When he finished, she said, "Say that plainly." Aldous blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You said it in contract language. Say it plainly." He held her gaze for a moment. "Your father signed over 3 years of your labor to satisfy his debt. You'll go to work at the Mallory Ranch. In exchange, this property will not be seized." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it, the kind you felt in your chest. "My father signed this," she said. Not a question. "Last week?" "Yes." Mara stood very still. Out past the fence line, one of the remaining cattle moved through the dry grass, head low, unbothered. The sun was still low and pale, just clearing the eastern ridge, and the light it cast made everything look slightly unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. "Give me an hour," she said. Mom. The conversation with her father was the shortest and worst conversation of her life. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd looked away from the contract, where he'd told her it would be fine, where she'd made and remade plans and numbers and contingencies for 2 years trying to hold things together, and he didn't look at her directly when she came in. He looked at the table. He'd aged badly in the past year, all at once, the way some men do when a thing they've been avoiding finally catches up to them. "Tell me you didn't," she said. He didn't say anything. "Tell me you didn't sign my name over like I was livestock." "I didn't have a choice, Mara." His voice was rough, worn down to something hollow. "They were going to take everything, the house, the land, everything. They might take everything anyway. You don't know what this Mallory situation is. You don't know what you've put me into." Varn said it was a reasonable household, said Mallory was... Varn said... She stopped herself, took a breath. Varn said, "Papa, do you hear yourself?" He finally looked up at her, and what she saw in his face was not the defiance she'd been braced for, not argument or justification, just a deep, broken shame that had nowhere to go. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know what else to do." Mara stood in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in and looked at her father and felt something she couldn't name precisely. Not just anger, though there was anger, and not just grief, though there was that too. Something more like the recognition of a fact she'd been circling around for years and was finally having to look at directly. She had been holding this family together with her own hands, and it had not been enough, and now she was going to pay for it in the most literal way possible. "I'm going to fix this," she said. He looked at her. "Mara, I'm going to fix this," she said again, quietly and without any particular emotion, the way you say something when you've decided it instead of when you're hoping it. "Keep the animals fed. Don't take on anything new. Don't sign anything." She went to pack her things. Hansuk. The wagon ride to the Mallory Ranch took most of the morning. Aldous drove. The other man rode alongside. Mara sat in the wagon bed with her bag and the small tin box that held what money she'd managed to save, not much, but hers, and watched the country roll past and thought. She thought about the contract Aldous had shown her. There were elements of it that troubled her, beyond the obvious trouble of her own situation. The language used to describe the transfer of her labor, the specific clauses, the way certain terms were defined, echoed things she'd seen in her father's original debt documents. Not just similar, almost identical in structure. The same buried conditions, the same shifting penalty thresholds, the same precise language that looked reasonable on a quick read and revealed its true function only when you slowed down and traced every clause back to its source. She thought about the Mallory Ranch. She knew almost nothing about it. She knew the name, Jace Mallory, somewhere east of the county seat. And she knew that whatever his situation was, it had been leveraged into accepting her. What kind of man agrees to that? What kind of debt puts someone in a position to make that agreement? The answer, she thought, probably looked a lot like what her father had just done. Desperation made people agree to things they would never have agreed to otherwise. That was the mechanism, wasn't it? Not force exactly, but pressure applied at the exact right moment when there was no good option, only bad ones and worse ones. She filed that away. The Mallory Ranch announced itself with its problems before they'd fully arrived. The fence line along the road was sagging in three places she could see from the wagon, one section held together with wire that had been patched over a patch. The pasture to the north looked like it hadn't been properly rotated in a couple of seasons, the grass thin and pale where the cattle had worked it over too hard and too long. The barn, visible from the road, had one side that looked recent and well-maintained, and another side that looked like it was losing an ongoing argument with gravity. A place that had been worked hard and was barely keeping up. A place where someone was fighting, just not quite winning. She climbed down from the wagon in the yard. The sun was full up now, warm and direct, and the air smelled like dust and dry hay and horse. Aldous said something she didn't fully hear about arrangements and expectations. She nodded without listening because she was looking at the man coming down from the porch. Jace Mallory was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in a way that suggested work rather than deprivation, though there was a tiredness to him that went deeper than physical. He had dark hair, several days of beard, and the kind of face that had probably been easier to read a few years ago, before whatever had been happening to him started happening. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Not unkind, but not comfortable either. Like a man who'd agreed to something and was only now, seeing it materialize in his yard, reckoning with what it actually meant. "Miss Kincaid," he said. His voice was neutral, careful. "Mr. Mallory," she said. He looked at Aldous. "Paperwork's in order?" "Everything's been signed," Aldous said. "Terms as discussed. 3 years of labor service, starting today." He handed Mallory a copy of the document. "Mr. Varn expects the standard quarterly reports on the debt reduction progress." Mallory took the document without looking at it. His eyes were still on Mara, and she had the distinct sense that he was trying to figure out how to handle this, what to say, whether there was any version of this situation that was not as uncomfortable as it felt. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," he said finally. "In a moment," she said. "First, I'd like to look at your debt documents." Dead silence. Aldous blinked. Mallory looked at her. Even the second rider seemed caught off guard, which she found mildly satisfying. "I'd like to see the debt documents," she said again, the same flat tone. "The originals, if you have them. I want to understand the full terms of what I've been transferred into." Mallory was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight recalibration, the same one she'd seen in Aldous earlier and was beginning to recognize as the look people got when they encountered something they hadn't expected. "After you're settled," he said. "We'll talk." Aldous and his companion rode out 10 minutes later. Mara watched them go, noted the direction they took, noted the time. Then she picked up her bag and followed Jace Mallory into the house. He gave her the small room off the back, the same kind of room she'd had at home. Functional, clean enough, a window that faced east. She set her bag down in her tin box and looked around and absorbed it. "You eat with the household," he said from the doorway. "I've got a ranch hand, Burl. Comes most days. There's a list of the main tasks on the kitchen table. I don't expect—" He stopped, started again. "I want to be clear about something. I didn't ask for this arrangement." "I know," she said. "That's not— I mean that I didn't go looking for a—" He seemed genuinely uncomfortable, which she found slightly reassuring, though she didn't know him well enough to trust the instinct yet. "This isn't how I'd have chosen to do things." "No," she said. "Me neither." She turned to face him. "But here we are, so I'd like to understand what I've walked into, what the actual debt situation is. Not the summary version Varn's people give, the actual documents, the original terms, what's happened since." He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because I spent 2 years trying to figure out what was happening to my father's debt, and I didn't put the pieces together fast enough to stop what happened. I'd rather not make that mistake twice." She held his gaze. "I'm good with numbers. I'm good with documents. If there's a way out of this situation, for either of us, it's probably buried in the paperwork." Mallory leaned against the doorframe and studied her with an expression she was starting to think might be his default one. Guarded, assessing, not hostile. the look of someone who'd been burned by trusting too quickly and was now careful in a way that had cost him some ease. "You can look at the documents," he said finally. "Tonight, after supper." "Thank you." He pushed off the doorframe. "It's a working ranch," he said. "Whatever else happens, the work still needs doing." "I know how to work," she said. He nodded once and left her to unpack. But she spent the afternoon learning the property. She told herself it was practical. She needed to know the layout, the resources, the problems. But it was also something older than practicality, some deep-running need she'd always had to understand the ground she was standing on. She walked the fence lines, checked the water situation, looked at the cattle, fewer than a spread this size should have carried, and spent a while in the barn going over the equipment, noting what was recent and what was aging toward failure. Burl, the ranch hand, watched her for a while with open curiosity. He was a stocky, weathered man in his 50s with a face like old leather and eyes that were sharper than they first appeared. He didn't say much, but he didn't avoid her either, which she appreciated. "How long have you worked here?" she asked him, running a hand along the side of one of the workhorses. 7 years, he said, going on 8. Was it different before? The operation. He considered this. Had more cattle, more help, a few more horses. He paused. It started changing about 4 or 5 years back. What changed? He looked at her sideways. You ask a lot of questions. I do, she agreed pleasantly. He was quiet for a moment, then debt got heavier. Started with one loan, then another one to help cover the first. You know how it goes? She did know how it went. Who holds the debt? Same man holds everything in this county, Burl said, and didn't say the name, but she heard it anyway in the shape of the silence. Supper was a quiet, careful meal. Jace cooked, nothing elaborate, beans and salt pork and cornbread, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate without much talk. She noticed things, the way he moved around the kitchen with a kind of automatic efficiency, like a man who'd been feeding himself alone for a while. The single photograph on the mantel in the other room, a woman and a child, neither of whom were present. The way he held himself slightly braced, like he was perpetually expecting something to go wrong. After supper, he cleared the table and disappeared for a while and came back with a wooden box. He set it on the table in front of her without a word. Inside were documents, a lot of them. She spent the next 2 hours going through them while the fire in the stove burned low and the night pressed against the windows. Jace sat across from her for the first hour, not reading, just present, occasionally watching her, and then moved to the other chair by the cold hearth, and she lost track of him in her concentration. The documents told a story she recognized. The original debt was not outrageous. A modest loan, reasonable terms, the kind of thing a working ranch might carry without undue strain. But layered on top of it, documented in subsequent agreements and addendums and modification notices, was a graduated accumulation of additional obligations, each one individually justifiable, each one triggering the next through a web of conditional clauses that were individually hard to see, but collectively designed to ensure the debt only ever grew. She found 3 clauses in particular that she circled. A variable penalty rate that activated when the principal dropped below a certain threshold, meaning that actually paying down the debt triggered new fees. A market adjustment provision that allowed Varn's office to revise the interest calculation annually based on criteria that weren't defined anywhere in the document. And a cross-default clause, buried in an addendum from 3 years ago, that linked Mallory's debt to the performance of 2 other accounts he likely didn't know were connected to his. She set down her pencil and looked up. Mallory was watching her from the other chair. When did you sign the addendum? She asked. The one from 3 years back, the one with the cross-default clause. He frowned. I'd have to check. There were several modifications over the years. The one that tied your debt to 2 other accounts. Do you know which accounts? A pause. No. What other accounts? That's what I'd like to know. She looked back at the document. The way this is written, if either of those unnamed accounts defaults, it adds a penalty to yours. Immediately. Without notice. Do you understand what that means? He was quiet. It means your debt can increase without you doing anything wrong, she said. Without missing a payment, without violating any term. Just because of something happening in an account you don't know exists. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. She could see him turning it over, fitting it against things he'd experienced, recalibrations happening. I paid down nearly $800 3 years ago, he said slowly, and the following quarter the balance was higher than when I started. Yes, she said, that's how it works. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She let him have the space. Outside, the night was dark and windless, the kind of darkness that made the land feel very large and the house feel very small. My wife took the boy and left 18 months ago, he said, not turning around. She said she didn't want to keep watch on a ship that was going under. Mara was quiet. I understood why she left, he said. I didn't have a better argument. The ship isn't going under, Mara said. It's being capsized deliberately. There's a difference. He turned around. His expression was hard to read in the low light, but something in it had shifted. Not hope, not quite, but the preliminary stirring of something that might become it. Can you prove that? He said. I can prove it for this ranch, she said. I don't know yet if I can prove it more broadly, but I'd bet my 3 years that your situation isn't unique. He came back to the table, sat down, looked at the documents spread between them, the circles she'd made, the notes in the margins. What do you need? He said. She folded her hands on the table. I need you to think back. Every family you know that's had dealings with Varn's office. Everyone who's talked about their debt changing in ways they didn't expect. Everyone who signed something and then watched things get worse instead of better. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There's the Harts, over on the Cutter Road. And Grady Shaw's been complaining about his numbers for years, though nobody takes him seriously because he complains about everything. He paused. The Vale widow. She had some trouble after her husband died, something about the estate and an outstanding note. I want to talk to all of them, Mara said. They're not going to want to talk. People out here don't. It's not the way things are done. You don't air your finances. I'm not asking them to air their finances. I'm asking them to compare documents. She looked at him directly. Mr. Mallory, someone built a machine designed to look like normal debt while actually doing something else entirely. The only way to see the machine is to look at enough of the parts to understand how they connect. She paused. One family's documents look like bad luck. 2 families' documents look like coincidence. Enough families' documents look like a pattern. He held her gaze for a long moment. My name is Jace, he said. Mara, she said. He nodded, looked down at the documents, picked up one of the pages she'd marked. The Harts keep records of everything, he said. Elma Hart is practically religious about it. Every bill, every transaction, every piece of paper that comes through that house. He looked up. If there's a pattern, she might have the documentation to show it. Then that's where we start, Mara said. Outside, the wind had picked up a little, moving through the dry grass with a sound like something whispering. The lantern on the table guttered once and steadied. The documents lay between them, covered in circles and questions, and the beginnings of something that was either going to save them or get them both into considerably more trouble than they were already in. Mara looked at the numbers again. She thought about the morning, the wagon ride, the way the land had looked coming in, the thin pastures, the sagging fence, the barn held together by stubbornness and wire. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table not looking at her. She picked up her pencil. She started counting. The Hart farm was 6 miles east of the Mallory place, down a road that turned to loose shale past the second creek crossing and required more patience than speed. Jace drove the wagon. Mara sat beside him with the document box between her feet and a second box she'd organized overnight on her lap. Her notes, her circles, her questions written out in the precise, compressed handwriting she'd developed over years of working in margins too small for anything else. They didn't talk much on the way out. The silence between them had changed slightly since the night before. Still cautious, still the silence of 2 people who didn't know each other, but with something underneath it now, some shared direction that hadn't been there before. It wasn't trust. It was something less than trust, but more than nothing. The thin beginning of a working arrangement between people who'd looked at the same problem and arrived at the same conclusions. The Hart place looked better tended than the Mallory ranch. That was the first thing Mara noticed. The fence was solid, the yard was swept, the kitchen garden to the south of the house was planted in straight rows with the kind of regularity that spoke to someone who kept order as a matter of principle. She filed that away. Elma Hart met them at the door. She was a compact, upright woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair pulled tight and eyes that moved to Mara and stayed there with an assessing quality that reminded Mara of looking in a mirror. "Jace Mallory," Elma said, and her tone was neutral in a way that wasn't quite warm but wasn't unfriendly. "And you'd be the Kincaid girl." "Mara Kincaid," she said. "Word travels," Elma said simply. "Come in." Her husband, Tom Hart, was at the kitchen table. He was a tall man who sat like he was trying to take up less space than he had, a particular posture Mara had seen before in men carrying things they couldn't put down. He shook Jace's hand and nodded at Mara and didn't ask any questions, which she interpreted as its own kind of welcome. They sat at the kitchen table the same way she and Jace had the night before, and Mara put her notes flat in front of her and said, without preamble, "I need to ask you about your debt with Varn's office, specifically about any changes in the terms you didn't expect or couldn't account for." The silence that followed was a particular kind, Rauchuan, not offended but waiting, the silence of people deciding how much to say. Tom looked at Elma. Elma looked at Mara. "Why?" Elma said. "Because I think what's happening to your debt isn't accidental," Mara said. "And I think if I look at your documents alongside Mr. Mallory's, I'm going to find the same structure, the same clauses, the same mechanism." Another silence. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. "You've been here one day," Tom said. "I know," Mara said. "I spent the previous 2 years watching the same thing happen to my father and not understanding it fast enough to stop it. I'm not interested in being slow again." Tom looked at Elma again. Something passed between them, the compressed language of a long marriage. "I keep records," Elma said finally. "Every piece of paper this household has ever received from Varn's office. 6 years of it." "I know," Mara said. "That's why we're here." Elma stood up and left the room. They heard her in the back of the house, the sound of something being moved, a chest or a cabinet. She came back carrying a bound stack of papers that she set on the table the way you'd set down something you'd carried a long time and were glad to put somewhere. "I kept them because I didn't trust the man," Elma said. "I didn't know exactly what I was keeping them for. Just seemed like the right thing to do." Mara untied the stack and began going through it. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper and the occasional creak of the house settling. She found the first matching clause 20 minutes in, a variable penalty provision, identical language to the one in Mallory's documents, buried 3 pages deep in an addendum dated 4.5 years ago. She set it aside and kept reading. She found the second one, the market adjustment provision, in a modification notice from the following year. By the time she found the third, the cross-default clause, she felt something in her chest go very still and very focused. "When did your balance increase without explanation?" she asked, not looking up. Tom answered without hesitation, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask the question. "Spring, 3 years ago. Paid down $400 over the winter, and came spring the balance was higher than when I started." "Same time as mine," Jay said quietly from across the table. Mara looked up. "Both of you, same season." "What does that mean?" Tom asked. "It means the cross-default accounts triggered at the same time," she said. "Both of your debts are linked to the same unknown accounts. When those accounts hit a threshold, whatever that threshold is, both of yours took the penalty simultaneously." She looked at both of them. "Your debt increases aren't random, they're coordinated." The kitchen was very quiet. Elma sat back down slowly. Her expression had gone from guarded to something harder and more focused. "He did this on purpose," she said. It wasn't a question. "The clauses are identical across 2 separate contracts," Mara said. "That doesn't happen by accident. Identical language and identical positions in documents given to different families in different years. Someone wrote these deliberately. Someone put them there knowing exactly what they'd do." Tom's jaw tightened. "If we could show that—" "We need more than 2, Mara said. 2 is coincidence. 3 is a pattern. 4 is a system." She looked at Jace. "Grady Shaw." Jace exhaled slowly. "Grady's not going to be easy." "Who's easy?" Mara said. "Dim Chem." Grady Shaw's place was another 4 miles north, and the road there was worse than the one to the Harts. The ranch itself looked like it had been losing arguments for longer. The yard was cluttered in the specific way of a man who'd stopped making decisions about where to put things and had simply started putting them down wherever he happened to be standing. Old equipment, coils of wire, a broken wagon wheel leaning against the side of the barn like it had given up but not left. Grady himself was on his porch when they pulled in, sitting in a chair that had seen better decades, whittling something with concentrated attention and making a point of not looking up until he was ready. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, with a gray beard that had grown past the point of intention into something that had its own agenda. He had small, bright, suspicious eyes that tracked both of them when he finally looked up, and his expression was the expression of a man who'd been telling people something was wrong for long enough that being told he was right would not, at this point, constitute good news. "Mallory," he said. Not unfriendly exactly, just flat. "Grady," Jace said, "this is Mara Kincaid. She's been looking at debt documents." "Has she?" Grady looked at Mara. "Kincaid. Clem's girl?" "Yes," she said. "Heard what happened?" He whittled for a moment. "Your daddy made some bad choices." "He did," she agreed, "with significant help." Grady stopped whittling. He looked at her more carefully. "Sit down," he said. They sat on the porch steps. Grady put down the whittling and reached beside his chair for a tin cup that probably had coffee in it from a while ago. He drank from it without seeming to notice whether it was cold. "I've been telling people for 10 years that something wasn't right about those debts," he said. "You know what they told me?" "That you were difficult," Mara guessed. "That I was difficult," he confirmed. "Couldn't manage money, didn't understand the terms I'd agreed to. Should have read more carefully." He said these things in a flat recitation, the words worn smooth from being turned over many times. "I read every word. I understood every term. And then the terms changed and I still understood them, and I said so, and nobody cared." "How long have you been keeping records?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "Since the beginning, 10 years. She felt it again, that stillness in her chest, that concentrated focus. "I need to see them." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up without a word and went inside. They heard him moving around in there, the sound of something heavy being dragged, a door opening. He was gone a while. When he came back, he was carrying what she could only describe as an archive. Stacked boxes, rubber-banded bundles, a system that looked chaotic, but when she asked him about it, turned out to be rigorously organized by year and transaction type. "You have everything," she said, looking at it spread across the porch. "I told you," he said, with a kind of exhausted pride. "I knew something was wrong. I just couldn't get anybody to listen." "I'm listening," she said. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not much, not dramatically, just a slight relaxation of something that had been held tight for a very long time. "Then let's get started," he said. They stayed at Grady's place until late afternoon. Mara went through 10 years of documents while Jace and Grady talked on the porch, and occasionally came in to point at things or answer questions. The patterns she'd found in the Mallory and Hart documents appeared in Grady's records as well, but earlier, which meant she could see the evolution of the mechanism. It had been refined over time. The earliest versions of the clauses were cruder, less elegantly buried. By the time they appeared in Jace's documents, whoever had written them had gotten considerably better at hiding what they were doing. She photographed nothing. She had no way to photograph anything, but she took notes in her compressed handwriting until her hand ached, transcribing the key language verbatim, recording dates, recording the amounts of unexplained increases and the quarters in which they'd occurred. By the time they loaded back into the wagon, she had a timeline. The mechanism had been active for at least 10 years. It had been implemented across at least 3 families, probably more. The increases were synchronized, which meant there was a trigger somewhere, some account or threshold that Varn's office controlled and activated when they wanted to widen the trap. The documents were signed by the families, which gave the whole structure a veneer of legitimacy. But the clauses that did the real work had been buried deliberately, described in terms that obscured their function, placed in positions in the documents where a person reading quickly or under pressure, which was to say, a person reading a financial document while already struggling, would almost certainly miss them. It was elegant, in the specific ugly way that exploitation can be elegant when it's been refined over years by someone with patience and intelligence and no conscience. "You're quiet," Jace said on the road back. "I'm thinking," she said. What are you thinking? She looked at the land going past. The dry hills, the bleached sky, the occasional spread in the distance that looked like it was fighting the same slow-losing battle as the Mallory Ranch. How many of them? How far did it reach? I'm thinking this is bigger than the three of us, she said. Maybe much bigger. And I'm thinking that if we're going to do anything with what I've found, we need to do it right. One wrong step and Varn has lawyers in front of a local judge who owes him something, and everything we've gathered gets dismissed as hearsay and sour grapes from people who defaulted on legitimate debt. Jace was quiet for a moment. So what do we need? More, she said. More families, more documents. Enough that the pattern is undeniable. And then we need someone outside Varn's reach to present it to. She paused. There's the Vale widow. You mentioned her. Ruth Vale, he said. Her husband died 2 years ago. The estate had a note with Varn's office, and she's been trying to settle it since. Aldous rides out there once a month. I want to talk to her. She's private, Jace said. Lost her husband, and now she's got that situation on top of it. She doesn't come to town much. I know how that feels, Mara said. Being in a situation you didn't choose and having no one you can safely talk to about it. She looked at him. That's actually why I think she'll talk to us. He thought about it. Tomorrow? Tomorrow, she said. The wagon rolled on through the failing afternoon light, the horse moving at its steady, practical pace, the wheels raising a thin trail of dust. The land on either side was wide and dry, and largely indifferent to the small human drama being conducted across it. Mara watched it and thought about her father at the kitchen table and the documents in the box at her feet, and the 10 years of records she'd just spent 4 hours going through. Somewhere behind all of it, behind the clauses and the addendums and the synchronized triggers and the carefully buried language, was a person who had decided that the families of Dustfall County were not people but resources. Not neighbors, but raw material. Not farmers and ranchers trying to hold on to something in hard country, but numbers in a calculation that had nothing to do with their actual lives. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this thought didn't make her afraid. It made her angry, which was considerably more useful. Ruth Vale lived at the end of a long approach road, the kind that announces a property before you arrive at it. The road itself was in good repair, the fence on either side solid and well-maintained, but there was a quality to it that Mara recognized. Maintenance without expansion. The work of someone keeping what existed from getting worse, but not building anything new. Not because they didn't want to, but because the energy for that kind of forward-looking effort had gone somewhere else. Ruth was younger than Mara expected. Mid-40s, maybe, with a stillness to her that wasn't quite grief anymore, but was the thing grief leaves behind when it finally moves on. A very precise attention to things, an absence of small talk, a way of looking directly at you that made pleasantries feel dishonest. She listened to Mara explain briefly and without unnecessary framing what she'd found and what she was trying to do. When Mara finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He sent you a letter," Ruth said. Jace looked up. "I'm sorry?" "Not you. When my husband's estate went into the review process, Varn sent a letter to his lawyer. My husband's lawyer forwarded it to me with a note saying I probably didn't need to read it, which meant I absolutely had to read it." She stood up. "I'll get it." The letter was 3 paragraphs, written on Varn's office letterhead. The first paragraph was standard legal framing, reference to the outstanding note, condolences on the death, standard language about estate obligations. The second paragraph was somewhat less standard. It discussed what Varn characterized as his latitude in managing estates and debt to his office, and what he described as his preference for cooperative resolution over adversarial process, with a suggestion that cooperation would be defined as the widow accepting a revised debt structure that he would provide under separate cover. The third paragraph contained a sentence that Mara read twice and then read aloud. As we have demonstrated in the management of similar accounts throughout this county, the terms available to cooperative parties are considerably more favorable than those facing uncooperative ones. Ruth was watching her. "He put it in writing," Mara said. "I thought so too," Ruth said. "That's why I kept it." Jace leaned over and read it, then read it again. "This is evidence," Mara said, "of intent. This is him, in his own words, telling her that the debt terms are negotiable based on whether she does what he wants." She looked up at Ruth. This is him admitting the terms aren't fixed, that they can be better or worse depending on factors that have nothing to do with the contract. Ruth's expression didn't change much, but something in her posture did. A slight relaxation, like a person finally putting down something they'd been holding for a long time without admitting how heavy it was. "I didn't know what to do with it," she said. "I couldn't go to the county magistrate. Varn's been friends with him for 15 years. "No," Mara said, "not the county magistrate." She looked at Jace, then back at Ruth. "How do you feel about federal jurisdiction?" Ruth blinked once. "I don't know what that means in practical terms." "It means beyond Varn's reach," Mara said. "It means a judge he can't influence." She looked at the letter again, at the letterhead, at the 3 careful paragraphs that had seemed to Ruth like something she didn't know what to do with, and that were, in fact, the most important piece of paper she'd seen yet. "You'd have to testify," Mara said. "Tell what you know. Allow this to be used." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the afternoon was deepening, the light going amber and long. A pair of horses moved slowly across the far pasture, taking their time. "He sent Aldous out here last month," Ruth said. "The month before that, it was Aldous too. The month before that, it was a man I hadn't seen before. Bigger, didn't introduce himself, just stood in the yard while Aldous talked and watched the house." She paused. "I understood what that was." "I know," Mara said quietly. "I'm tired of understanding things I can't do anything about," Ruth said. She looked at Mara directly. "What do you actually need from me?" "The letter," Mara said. "Your testimony about the timeline of what happened to your estate account, and whatever else you have, payment records, any notices you received, anything that documents the changes in what you owed." Ruth stood up. "I'll make tea," she said. "This is going to take a while." It took 2 hours. By the time they left, Mara had filled the rest of her notepad and had the letter folded carefully in the inside pocket of her coat, wrapped in a square of oilcloth Ruth had offered without being asked. They drove back to the Mallory Ranch in the dark, the horses finding the road by habit more than sight, the stars overhead clear and indifferent and very far away. "Varn's going to notice," Jace said, "when Aldous rides out to Ruth's next month and she doesn't behave the same way. He's going to know something's changed." "I know," Mara said. "That means we have a timeline. We don't have forever to put this together." "I know that too." She thought about the letter in her pocket, the 2 boxes of documents, the 10 years of Grady's records, the Hart family's 6 years of careful filing. "We have enough to show a pattern," she said. "We need one more thing." "What?" "Someone who can verify the legal interpretation, someone who understands contract law well enough to look at what we have and say, clearly and on record, that these clauses do what I think they do." She paused. "Not a local lawyer." "There's nobody—" "I know there's nobody local we can trust," she said. "Varn has reach here. We need someone from outside." She was quiet for a moment. "There's a federal land office in Harmon City. They deal with contract disputes when they cross county lines. If these debts cross county lines, and I think they do, I think this isn't only Dustfall County, then they have jurisdiction to at least look." Jace was quiet for a long stretch. The horses moved steadily, their breath visible in the cooling air. The dark land spread out around them, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and went silent. "You came off that wagon this morning," he said finally, "and asked to look at my documents." "Yes." "You've been here 3 days." "Almost 3 days." He was quiet again. She could feel him working through it, the same way she worked through things, not resisting exactly, but wanting to understand the full shape before committing to it. "If we go to Harmon City," he said, "and we're wrong, or we're not ready, or the evidence isn't strong enough, Varn finds out we tried and failed, and every family who talked to us is worse off than before." "Yes," she said, "that's correct. So we can't go until we're sure." "No," she said, "we can't." "How long?" She thought about the documents she'd seen today, the patterns she'd traced, what she still needed. "A few more weeks," she said. "Maybe a month. There are at least 2 other families I want to talk to. I want Grady's records cross-referenced completely. And I want to find out what the trigger accounts are, the ones that activated the cross-default penalties. If I can identify those and show they're controlled by Varn directly, the whole structure is visible." Jace turned the wagon into the approach road to his ranch. The dark shape of the barn appeared ahead, and past it, the house with a lamp still burning in the kitchen window. Burl, probably, who had a habit of leaving lights on. "All right," Jace said. She looked at him. "All right?" "We do it right," he said. "We take the time we need. We don't move until it's solid." He paused. "But we move." It wasn't much. It wasn't a declaration or a promise or anything that looked, on the surface, like a turning point. But Mara had learned to recognize the moments when things actually shifted, as opposed to the moments that looked like they should be shifts but weren't. This was real. He'd made a decision, not out of desperation, not because he had no other option, but because he'd looked at what she'd put in front of him and decided it was true and worth acting on. That was something. In her experience, that was actually quite a lot. She climbed down from the wagon and carried her document box toward the house. The night air was cold and clean and smelled like dry grass and coming winter. Behind her, she heard Jace settle the horses, heard the familiar sounds of the barn. Inside, she put the box on the kitchen table and took out the letter from Ruth Vale's dead husband's lawyer and unfolded it under the lamplight, as we have demonstrated in the management of similar accounts throughout this county. Throughout this county. Not in one account, not in one family's situation. Throughout. As if it were so routine it barely warranted specificity, as if it were simply the way things worked. She read it again. Then she picked up her pencil and started writing down everything she needed to do next. 3 weeks passed the way hard weeks do. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a relentless forward pressure, each day carrying more weight than the one before it. Mara and Jace fell into a pattern that neither of them had designed and neither of them remarked on. Mornings were for the ranch, the actual work of the place, the cattle and the fence and the equipment that needed constant attention to stay functional. She learned the land the same way she'd learned her father's land, through repetition and observation, through the specific education of doing the same thing in the same place enough times that the place starts telling you things. She noticed that the north pasture had better grass than Jace was using it for. She noticed that 2 of the fence sections he kept repairing needed to be replaced entirely, not patched again, and that patching them was costing more in time and wire than replacement would. She said these things plainly when she saw them, not as criticism but as fact, and he listened the same way, taking it in without defense, adjusting. Evenings were for the documents. She had commandeered the kitchen table in a way that had gone unaddressed. Jace ate at the far end now, leaving her the working half, and she'd stopped noticing the arrangement and he'd stopped commenting on it, which was its own form of accommodation. The table was covered most nights in the organized archaeology of other people's financial ruin. The heart records, cross-indexed with dates. Grady's decade of evidence, which she'd been working through systematically. Her own notes, now filling a second pad. Ruth Vale's letter, which she'd copied 3 times, once for her working file, once in a clean hand for what she was beginning to think of as the formal record, once hidden separately in case anything happened to the others. She'd found 2 more families in the intervening weeks. The Colbys, who ran a small operation southeast of the Mallory place and had been so certain their debt problems were their own fault that it took Mara 45 minutes of careful conversation before either of them would admit that the numbers hadn't made sense to them either. And old Pete Dunnigan, who was mostly retired but had held a note with Varn's office for 8 years, and whose son had been paying against it without making progress, and had finally given up and moved the family to the next county over, which Mara noted in her timeline as the exact kind of outcome the mechanism was designed to produce. 5 families, 10 years of records. 1 letter written in Varn's own institutional voice admitting that the terms were not fixed, that cooperation was rewarded and resistance was not. She laid it all out on the table one Sunday evening, the whole case assembled for the first time as a single unified picture, and sat back and looked at it. Jace came in from the barn and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. He'd gotten used to the organized chaos of her working process, but something about tonight's arrangement was different and he seemed to feel it. "Is that all of it?" he asked. "All of what we have," she said. "Not all of what exists." He came to the table and stood beside her and looked at it. She watched his face as he took it in. The timeline running across the top, the family records arranged below it in columns, the cross-reference marks where the same clause appeared in multiple documents, the red ink circles around the synchronized penalty dates. "It's the same date," he said, pointing to 3 separate documents. "The penalty triggers. Same quarter, 3 different years." The trigger account's activated in March, she said. Every time. I think it's a calendar function. I think Varn's office sets them to activate in the first quarter when families have fewer resources after winter, when they're least able to absorb an unexpected increase. He was quiet. The two unknown accounts the cross-default clause links to, she continued, I think I've identified them. Or at least, I know where to look. There's a business registry in Harmon City. If those accounts are registered entities rather than personal accounts, they'd be on file. I think they're shell accounts. I think Varn controls them directly and uses them as the mechanism to trigger the penalties. You can't know that without seeing the registry. No, she said, which is one of the things we need Harmon City for. He pulled out the chair next to hers and sat down. Not across the table, not at the far end. Next to her, looking at the same arrangement of documents from the same angle. She noticed this and didn't say anything about it. When? He said. I want one more thing first, she said. I want to know if there are families in the adjoining county. If this crosses county lines, the federal jurisdiction argument is cleaner, and it makes the scale undeniable. She paused. Grady mentioned a family called the Prossers. They had dealings with Varn's office and sold out 2 years ago and moved on. They're in Alderton County now, Jace said. Grady knows them. Then Grady needs to write them a letter, Mara said. Today, if possible. The letter went out the next morning. The answer came back 8 days later, which was faster than Mara had hoped, and its contents were better than she'd expected. The Prosser family not only had documents from their time dealing with Varn, they had documents, and they were angry, and the two things together made them exactly the kind of witnesses that a case needed. Their debt had carried the same clauses. Their unexplained increases had occurred in the same quarter as everyone else's. And they had sold their land, ultimately, at a price that Varn's representative had negotiated on their behalf, which was a detail that made Mara sit very still for a moment when she read it. He'd gotten them to sell. He'd reduced the debt pressure just enough at the right moment to make selling seem like relief. And then his representative had handled the sale. She went back through her notes. The Dunnigan family, whose son had left. Had anyone handled the transition of their property? She wrote that question down in capital letters and underlined it. She was still sitting there with the question underlined in front of her when she heard a horse in the yard. Not the usual sound of someone arriving, not the steady approach of a person with ordinary business. This was a horse that had been ridden hard and stopped sharply, and it was followed by a silence that had a particular quality she'd learned in her years on a working property to pay attention to. She went to the window. 2 riders in the yard. One she recognized, Aldous, Varn's administrative man, sitting his horse with his usual pale patience. The other she didn't recognize and didn't want to. He was large, not just tall, but heavy through the chest and arms in a way that looked functional rather than incidental, and he sat his horse with a stillness that wasn't relaxation. The stillness of someone waiting for a specific kind of instruction. Jace came in from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. She heard him stop in the yard. Heard Aldous begin talking, the specific smooth cadence of a man delivering a message he'd been given rather than one he'd composed himself. She went to the door and stood in it. Aldous was talking about payment schedules, about the upcoming quarterly review, about Mr. Varn's interest in ensuring that the terms of the transfer agreement were being honored in their full intent. The language was polite. The large man said nothing. He looked at the house while Aldous talked, and then he looked at Mara in the doorway, and then he looked at the house again. Miss Kincaid, Aldous said, seeming to notice her, I hope you're finding the arrangement acceptable. I'm finding it informative, she said. Something shifted very slightly in Aldous' expression. The large man's gaze moved back to her. Mr. Varn wanted to convey his appreciation for the cooperation of all parties, Aldous said, and to note that any disruptions to the established arrangements in this county would be a matter of significant concern to him. The word disruptions landed in the air between them with a very deliberate weight. Jay said, That sounds like a concern to express to the relevant parties, then. Indeed, Aldous said. I'm expressing it now. He looked from Jace to Mara and back. To the relevant parties. There was a moment of silence. The large man hadn't moved. A fly buzzed somewhere near the barn. The mid-morning sun was flat and bright and cast short shadows. Mara stepped out of the doorway and walked to the edge of the porch. She took her second notepad from her apron pocket. She carried it everywhere now, and opened it and wrote down the date, the time, the names of both riders, and a verbatim transcription of the word disruptions in its context. She wrote slowly and clearly, and she did not look up while she wrote, and when she was done, she looked up. Aldous was watching her. "Just keeping records," she said pleasantly. The silence stretched another moment. Then Aldous touched his hat and said they'd be on their way. The large man looked at her for one additional second, not threatening, not quite, but communicating something, and then turned his horse and followed. She watched them ride out. She kept watching until they were past the gate and on the road and the dust had settled. Jace came to stand beside her. "That was Hollis," he said quietly. "Drake Hollis. He works for Varn." "What does he do for Varn?" A pause. "Whatever needs doing that Aldous isn't the right tool for." She wrote the name down. "He knows we've been talking to people," she said. "Probably. That means the window is shorter than I thought." She closed the notepad and looked at Jace. "We're going to Harmon City this week." They left on Thursday. Grady came too. His idea, offered without discussion, delivered as a simple statement over the fence between his property and the road. "I'm coming. 10 years I've been waiting for something to do with this. I'm not watching from the fence." Mara accepted this without argument because Grady's records were a significant portion of what they were carrying, and because she'd developed, in the past month, something close to respect for the man's stubborn, inconvenient persistence. Elma Hart sent a letter with them, carefully written, formally addressed. Ruth Vale sent the original letter, not a copy, the original, in a sealed envelope that she pressed into Mara's hands with both of hers and held for a moment without saying anything. Mara understood. She'd carry it carefully. The road to Harmon City was a day's drive. They camped one night on the road, which was awkward in the specific way that arrangements between people who are still figuring out what they are to each other tend to be awkward. Grady solved the social geometry of it by simply going to sleep immediately upon lying down, which was either genuine exhaustion or tactful disengagement, and Mara found herself sitting by the small fire with Jace in a silence that was less uncomfortable than it might have been a month ago. "What do you think happens if they turn us away?" he said. "I think we find a different avenue," she said. "There's a federal land commission in the capital. Takes longer, but the reach is wider." "You've already thought about the contingency." "I think about contingencies," she said. "It's a habit." He was quiet for a moment. The fire was small and well managed. Good habits died hard. "What happens after?" he said. "If it works? If Varn's case unravels? Your 3 years aren't up." She looked at the fire. She'd thought about this too, though less than the contingencies, because it felt like the kind of thinking that was dangerous to do too early. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I know I want to go back and see my father. I know I want to make sure whatever happens covers his situation too. Beyond that," she paused, "I haven't spent much time thinking about after. I've mostly been thinking about the steps between here and there." "That's probably wise," he said. "It's not wisdom," she said. "It's just the only way I know how to move. One thing, then the next thing." He looked at the fire. Then, "For what it's worth, you can stay if you want. After. Not because of the papers, just if you wanted to." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire and not at her, which she suspected was intentional. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once. They didn't say anything else for a while, and then the fire burned down, and they both went to sleep. The federal land office in Harmon City occupied the second floor of a brick building on the main street, above a dry goods store, and the man behind the desk when they arrived was a clerk named Ferris, who had the look of someone who dealt mostly in paperwork and found unexpected visitors moderately disorienting. Mara set the first box of documents on his desk without preamble. "I need to speak with whoever handles financial fraud complaints under federal land jurisdiction," she said. Ferris blinked. That would be under the auspices of the Land Commissioner's office, where is the Land Commissioner's office? The Commissioner himself is in the capital, but there's a regional adjudicator who handles— "Get him," she said. The regional adjudicator was a man named Clement Bryce, who came down from his upstairs office 20 minutes later with the slightly irritated expression of a man pulled away from something he considered more important. He was in his late 50s, compact, with the air of someone who'd processed a large number of complaints over a long career and developed a certain protective skepticism. He sat down across from Mara and looked at the document on the top of her stack, the Hart contract, with her annotations, and said, "What am I looking at?" "A coordinated financial fraud scheme operating across at least 2 counties, Mara said. "Active for a minimum of 10 years. I have documentation from 6 families, including original contracts, payment records, modification notices, and correspondence from the operating party admitting that the terms are adjustable based on cooperation." Bryce looked at her over the document. "That's a significant claim. I have significant documentation." He picked up the Hart contract and read the first page. His expression didn't change. He turned to the second page. On the third page, where the first buried clause appeared, she watched him slow down. He read it again. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In the contract," she said. "Page 3, third paragraph, subsection C." He looked up at her. "I mean, are you a lawyer?" "No," she said. "I can count." He set the Hart contract down and looked at the stack. "How many of these are there?" "Enough," she said. "Do you want to see them?" He looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled his chair closer to the desk. "Show me," he said. She opened the second box. For the next 3 hours, Bryce went through the documents while Mara guided him through the annotations, and Jason Grady sat against the wall and answered questions when Bryce directed them at someone who'd actually lived inside one of the contracts. The adjudicator was thorough, more thorough than she'd expected, asking about dates and sequences and asking her to walk him through the cross-default mechanism twice, the second time with paper and pencil, drawing it out. When she showed him Ruth Vale's letter, he read it 4 times, set it down, picked it up, read it again. "He put it in writing," Bryce said. "Yes," Mara said. "A man that careful about his contract language wrote this carelessly." "I don't think he thought she'd do anything with it," Mara said. "I think he thought she was alone and frightened and had no one to bring it to." Bryce set the letter down very precisely, aligning it with the edge of his desk. He had the look of a man recalibrating, something careful and professional in his expression, giving way to something more direct. "The cross-county element," he said. "The Prosser family in Alderton. Same clause structure, same quarterly trigger pattern. Identical language in a contract signed 18 months after the earliest one I have here." She paused. "It crossed county lines. That's federal jurisdiction." "It's federal jurisdiction if I recommend escalation," he said, "and I'd need to document the basis for that recommendation thoroughly." He looked at the document spread across his desk. "Which you appear to have done for me." "Will you?" she said. "Recommend escalation?" He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the stack, then back at her. "Miss Kincaid," he said, "I've been in this office 11 years. In 11 years, I have received 3 formal complaints about Ezekiel Varn's lending practices. Every one of them was withdrawn before it reached review. Everyone." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "That people were pressured into withdrawing," she said, "or frightened into it, or simply ran out of resources to continue." He folded his hands on the desk. "What I have in front of me right now is the most documented complaint I have ever received about anything in this region. If this is what you say it is, it's what I say it is," she said. "Look at the dates. Look at the language. Look at the triggers." "I intend to," he said. "I'm going to need your originals. I'll provide receipts. I'll need written statements from each family willing to provide them. And I need to consult with the Federal Land Commissioner before I can promise anything beyond a review." He paused. "But I'm recommending escalation. Today. Before I go home." Jace, from the wall, exhaled a breath Mara hadn't realized he'd been holding. Grady said, almost to himself, 10 years. Bryce looked at him. "Sir, I've been saying something was wrong for 10 years, Grady said. His voice was rough. Nobody listened. Bryce looked at him for a moment. "I'm listening now," he said simply. Mara began organizing the originals into a clean stack for transfer. Her hands were steady. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper and the muffled noise of the street below. She thought about Drake Hollis in the yard, looking at the house. She thought about Aldous saying disruptions with that deliberate weight. She thought about Varn somewhere in his office, managing his accounts, believing the mechanism was invisible, believing that enough careful language and isolated families would keep everything contained. She handed the stack across the desk to Bryce. "I'll need those receipts," she said. "Detailed ones. Every document listed by name, date, and originating party." Bryce reached for his pen. "Of course," he said. Outside, Harmon City continued its afternoon business, completely unaware that the thing that had been built to be invisible had just been seen for the first time by someone with the authority to do something about it. The receipts Bryce gave them were 4 pages long, itemized in precise clerical handwriting, every document listed by family name and date. Mara folded them into the oilcloth with the copy of Ruth's letter and put them in the inside pocket of her coat before they left the building. She didn't fully relax until they were back on the street, and the document boxes, now lighter, now in the custody of the Federal Land Office, were no longer her responsibility to protect. Jace noticed. "You all right?" "I'll be all right when we're back on the road," she said. Grady was already at the wagon, checking the horses with the focused attention of a man who needed something practical to do with his hands. He didn't say much on the drive out of Harmon City, but somewhere past the city limits, with the open country opening up around them again, he said quietly, "You think it'll hold?" "Bryce seemed serious," Jace said. "Bryce is a clerk," Grady said, not unkindly. "Serious clerks still answer to people above them." "He said he'd recommend escalation today," Mara said, "before he went home." I believed him. Believing a man and being right about him aren't always the same thing. "No," she agreed. "They're not." They camped in the same spot as the night before, by instinct more than plan. The fire was smaller this time. Less need for warmth, or maybe less need for the ritual of it. Grady fell asleep again with his characteristic efficiency. Mara and Jace sat on opposite sides of the fire, and she thought about what came next, and he thought about whatever he thought about when he was quiet, which she still didn't entirely know. "Hollis is going to come back," she said. "I know. When Aldous does his next round and finds people less cooperative, Varn's going to know something happened. And when he figures out it wasn't just talking among neighbors..." She paused. "He's going to push." "Let him push," Jace said. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been building for a long time and was finding its way to the surface. "I need you to stay calm when he does," she said. "Whatever Hollis says or does when they come, I need you not to react in a way that gives them something to use." He looked at her across the fire. "I know how to handle myself." "I know you do," she said. "That's not what I mean. I mean, if Hollis makes it physical, which is possible, we document it. We don't escalate it. We make it part of the record." He was quiet. "Every threat, every visit, every piece of intimidation? That's evidence too," she said. "We've been treating the financial documents as the case, but the intimidation is part of the case. If Bryce's escalation reaches a judge, we want that judge to see not just the contracts, but the pattern of behavior around the contracts. The visits. The large man in the yard saying nothing and looking at the house. The word disruptions delivered with intention." "You want him to threaten us," Jace said slowly. "You're not just saying be calm. You're saying let it happen." "I'm saying if it happens, we use it," she said. "There's a difference." He turned that over. She watched him turn it over. The set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man doing real thinking rather than just reacting. "All right," he said finally. "All right." They were home by the following afternoon. For 10 days, nothing happened. The ranch work continued. The cattle were rotated to the north pasture, which did what Mara had said it would do. The animals put weight on faster with the better grass, something Burl noted with a brief approving grunt that constituted high praise from him. 2 of the fence sections were finally replaced rather than patched, and Jace spent a full day on the job with a post-hole digger in ground that hadn't been broken in years, coming in that evening with his hands raw and his expression satisfied in the specific way of physical work completed properly. Mara wrote letters to the Prosser family in Alderton County, thanking them for their documents and asking 2 follow-up questions. To the Colbys, asking them to compile a clean summary of their payment history by year. To Elma Hart, asking her to write down, in her own words and in sequence, the specific moments when she'd noticed something wrong. Not the legal language, but her experience of it, what it had felt like from inside. She did this because Bryce had mentioned in his careful administrative way that personal testimony alongside documentation was considerably more difficult to dismiss. Contracts were contracts, and lawyers could argue over language. But a person describing clearly and from their own life the moment they paid down $400 in good faith and watched their balance rise anyway, that was harder to redirect into procedural dispute. She also did it because she thought the families deserved to have their actual experience matter, not just their paperwork. On the 11th day, 2 riders came down the approach road in the late afternoon, and one of them was Drake Hollis. She was in the kitchen when she heard them. She didn't look out the window immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing, put a period at the end, set down her pencil, and then went to the window. Hollis and a man she didn't recognize, younger, nervous-looking. They'd stopped in the yard but hadn't dismounted. That was intentional. Staying on horseback was a deliberate choice when you had business at a house, the kind of choice that communicated something about who was expected to come to whom. Jace came around the side of the barn. He'd been working on the far fence. He had a hammer in his hand, not as a threat, just because he'd been working and hadn't put it down. She took her notepad and went outside. Hollis was a large man in his 40s, with a face that had been arranged by time, and probably some violence into an expression of permanent mild displeasure. He had pale eyes that moved to Mara when she came out and stayed there, and she had the immediate impression that he'd been told about her specifically and had formed an opinion in advance. "Mallory," he said, not looking at Jace, looking at her. Mr. Varn wanted to have a conversation about some recent activities. "You're not Mr. Varn," Mara said. The pale eyes moved to her with a slight additional focus. "I represent his interests." "Then you can convey a message," she said pleasantly. She opened her notepad and wrote the date and time and Hollis's name. "What would Mr. Varn like to discuss?" A pause. Hollis seemed to have expected something different, deference maybe, or at least uncertainty. He regrouped without showing it. "There's been a pattern of visitors to certain properties, certain conversations. Mr. Varn is aware of the trip to Harmon City." Nobody said anything. The younger rider shifted slightly in his saddle. "Mr. Varn wants to make clear," Hollis continued, his voice even and deliberate, "that the arrangements in this county are well established, lawfully documented, and under the protection of the relevant local offices. Any attempt to disrupt those arrangements would be viewed as an act of bad faith by the parties involved. And bad faith has consequences." She was writing, all of it, verbatim. The word disrupt again, consequences. She wrote it all down in the same careful hand she used for everything. "What kind of consequences?" she asked, still writing, not looking up. The question caught him slightly off balance, not because it was unexpected, but because the manner in which it was asked was. She sounded like someone taking a deposition. "The kind that make a difficult situation considerably more difficult," he said. "Could you be more specific, for the record?" "There is no record," Hollis said, and something shifted in his voice. She looked up, met his eyes. "There's my record," she said. "I have the date, the time, your name, and a verbatim account of this conversation as it's occurring. When you say consequences, I'd like to have a clear description of what you mean so that if those consequences materialize, I can accurately document the connection between this conversation and subsequent events." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of statement. Jace hadn't moved. He was standing 10 feet to her left with the hammer still in his hand, watching Hollis with an expression that gave nothing away. Hollis looked at the notepad, then at Mara, then, for the first time, at Jace, then back at Mara. "Mr. Varn will be in touch directly," he said. His voice had flattened into something that was trying to sound neutral and mostly succeeding. "We look forward to that," she said. "Please give him my regards." Hollis held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his horse and rode out, the younger man following close behind. She kept riding until the sound of their horses was off the property. Date, time, departure. Full transcript of the exchange. She noted the name of the younger rider as unknown, described him by approximate age and build, described the horses. She wrote it all down the way she wrote everything, completely, without editorial commentary, just the facts of what had happened laid out in sequence. When she stopped writing, her hand was shaking slightly. Not from fear, from the particular physical release of sustained effort, The way hands shake after you've held something heavy for a long time and finally set it down. Jace came and stood beside her. He looked at what she'd written. That was something, he said quietly. We needed it documented, she said. I know. He paused. I'm not criticizing. She looked at the road where the riders had gone. The dust had already settled. The afternoon was still and warm. A hawk made a long, slow circle over the south pasture. He knows about Harmon City, she said. That means someone at the land office talked. Or Bryce's escalation triggered something in the system that Varn has a way of seeing. How does that change things? It means we have less time than I thought. She looked at him. Bryce told me the commissioner would take 2 to 3 weeks to review. We're at 11 days. I need to contact Bryce and tell him what just happened. And I need to write to the other families. If Hollis went to us, he's going to go to them too. She wrote 4 letters that evening. To Bryce, describing the visit, the language used, the timeline, requesting acknowledgement that the escalation was still active. To the Harts, the Colbys, Ruth Vale, and Grady Shaw. Brief, plain, direct. They know about Harmon City. Be steady. Document everything. Do not agree to any new terms or modifications. We are close. She rode into town herself the next morning to post them, which was the first time she'd been in Dustfall's main street since arriving at the Mallory Ranch. It felt different than she expected. Not smaller exactly, but more visible. The dry goods store, the post office, the county courthouse at the end of the main block with its weather-worn flag. The lending office, 2 buildings down from the courthouse, with its clean-painted sign and its respectable facade and its windows that showed nothing of what operated inside. She posted the letters and was on her way back to the wagon when she nearly walked into Aldous on the boardwalk. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other. Miss Kincaid, he said. Mr. Aldous, she said. He seemed to be considering something, not the usual calculation. This was something less controlled. What you're doing, he said quietly, and stopped. She waited. The families you've been talking to, he said. Some of them. They're not the sort who can weather a prolonged fight. Whatever you think you've built, if it takes too long, they'll wear down. They always do. Is that a warning? She asked. Or an observation? He looked at her for a moment. His face was hard to read. She'd thought of him as a man without much interior life, a function rather than a person. But up close she could see that she'd been wrong about that. There was something complicated happening in his expression. Take it as you like, he said, and stepped around her and walked on. She stood on the boardwalk and watched him go and thought about what he'd said. Not the content of it, the manner. There was no satisfaction in it, no warning wrapped in pleasure the way Hollis's implied threats had been. It had sounded almost like something said to spite itself, not on instruction. She filed it away with everything else and drove back to the ranch. Bryce's response arrived 7 days later. It was brief and careful, and written in the language of a man who was aware that correspondence could be intercepted. The matter has been escalated to the regional commissioner as discussed. Formal review is underway. I have been asked to inform you that Federal Judge Nathaniel Crow has been appointed to oversee the proceedings. You will receive formal notification of the hearing date within the next 2 weeks. In the meantime, please preserve all additional documentation that may have come to your attention since our meeting. She read it twice, then read it to Jace across the kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment, then, a federal judge. Yes. Not a county magistrate, not a regional administrator. No, she said. A federal judge. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She understood the feeling. It was the feeling of something you'd been pushing against suddenly giving way. The surprise of forward motion after sustained resistance. Varn can't reach a federal judge, he said. His lawyers can try to complicate the proceedings, she said, but a federal judge isn't going to be managed by local influence. She folded the letter. We need to be ready, all of us. The families need to understand that this isn't the kind of hearing where you submit paperwork and go home. We'll need to be present. We'll need to be able to speak. Some of them are scared, Jace said. I know. The Colbys especially. Ed Colby barely spoke when you were there. His wife did all the talking. His wife was clear and specific and remembered everything, Mara said. She'll do fine. And Ruth Vale. She's been alone out there since Hollis went by. She sent word that they'd come twice since Harmon City. That landed harder than she showed. Is she all right? She says so. He paused. Whether that's true or just what she felt like saying in a letter, I don't know. Mara made a decision. I'm going to her, she said. Tomorrow. I'll spend a day, make sure she's steady, go over what a hearing will look like. She paused. You should go to Grady. Make sure he hasn't done something independently. He's been waiting 10 years to say something out loud to someone official, and I need him to wait 2 more weeks. Jace almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the shape of one, a brief softening around the eyes. Grady's going to give a judge an earful. Grady is going to give a judge 10 years of documented evidence, she said, which is going to be considerably more useful than an earful. The notification arrived on a Wednesday, 2 weeks and 4 days after Bryce's letter, delivered by a man from the Federal Land Commissioner's office who rode out to the Mallory Ranch personally and handed it to Mara with the particular formality of a man carrying something official. Federal hearing, Dustfall County Courthouse, Judge Nathaniel Crow presiding. 14 days' time. All parties named in the complaint were required to attend. Ezekiel Varn and representatives of his lending office were formally required to appear and present their accounts and documentation for review. She read it standing in the yard. The man from the commissioner's office waited while she read it, as if expecting a response. She looked up. Thank you, she said. He nodded and rode out. She stood with the notification in her hands and looked at the horizon. The dry hills, the pale sky, the scatter of land that looked the same as it had every day she'd been here. It didn't look different. Nothing visible had changed, but something had shifted in the architecture of things, some structural element that had seemed permanent having turned out to be less permanent than it looked. She walked into the house and sat down at the kitchen table and held the notification flat on the surface and looked at it. Then she picked up her pencil and started a list, everything that needed to happen in the next 14 days. Letters to each family. A rehearsal of what to say at the hearing and what not to say. A clean copy of the complete case. Every document, every date, every connection between them, organized in the order that would be most legible to a judge seeing it for the first time. The work was familiar. It was always the same work. Count what you have, identify what you're missing, close the gap. Jace came in from outside, read the look on her face, and looked at the paper on the table. He didn't say anything. He went to the stove and put the kettle on, and while it heated, he stood with his back to her and looked out the window at nothing in particular. 14 days, she said. 14 days, he agreed. Outside, the afternoon went on doing what afternoons did. The light shifting, the shadows lengthening, the hawk still making its patient circles over the south pasture. Somewhere down the county road, in offices and on ranches, and in a small house where a widow had been visited twice by men who meant to frighten her, people were holding on to things they'd been told they'd never get back. Mara put her pencil to paper and started writing. The 14 days before the hearing were the longest of Mara's life, and also, in a way she wouldn't fully understand until later, the most clarifying. She spent the first 3 days traveling between the families. Ruth Vale first, because Ruth had been visited twice, and because Mara had been thinking about her in that particular way. You think about someone you're responsible for when you can't be with them. She found Ruth steady, not unbothered, not performing calm she didn't have, but genuinely composed in the way of a woman who'd made her decision and was living inside it. The second visit from Hollis's men had shaken her, she admitted, but it had also made something simpler. There was no longer any ambiguity about what Varn was willing to do or what kind of man he was. That clarity, Ruth said, was almost a relief. When you don't know the shape of something, it's harder to face, Ruth said. When you know exactly what it is, you can at least stand correctly. Mara thought about that for the rest of the drive to the Colbys. Ed Colby was still quiet, still took up as little space as a large man could manage. But when Mara sat at his kitchen table and walked him through what the hearing would look like, not the legal abstractions, but the physical reality, who would be in the room, who would speak when, what a judge's questions tended to sound like, something in him settled. He didn't become talkative, but he asked 2 questions, both sharp and practical, and when she answered them, his eyes cleared. His wife, Carrie, made coffee and sat next to him and didn't take her hand off his arm the whole time Mara was there. That was its own kind of testimony. Grady was Grady. He had opinions about how the hearing should be run, which he expressed at length, and Mara listened to all of them and redirected him gently each time toward the thing she actually needed from him, which was his 10 years of records presented in the order she'd specified, not the order that felt most satisfying to him emotionally. He grumbled. He complied. He also, at the end of the visit, shook her hand with both of his and held it a moment and didn't say anything, which from Grady was the equivalent of a speech. The hearts were already prepared. Elma had written the personal testimony Mara had asked for weeks ago and had revised it twice since. She handed over a clean copy with the slightly fierce satisfaction of someone who'd done a job to a standard they were proud of. Tom had compiled a chronological summary of every payment they'd made and every unexplained increase they'd received, laid out in a table that was cleaner than most of Mara's own work, which she told him, and he shrugged and said he'd been a ledger keeper before he'd been a rancher. "You never mentioned that," she said. "You never asked," he said. She used his table in the final presentation. The night before the hearing, she sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, going through the assembled case one final time. She had organized it into a sequence. First the structural evidence, the clauses, the cross-default mechanism, the synchronized trigger dates across multiple families, then the personal testimony, each family's experience of what those clauses had done to their actual lives, in their own words. Then Ruth's letter, which she'd saved deliberately for the center of the presentation, the moment when the pattern shifted from inferred to stated. And finally, the Prosser documents from Alderton County, which established the cross-county reach and the federal jurisdiction, and which she intended to present last as the frame that contained everything else. Jace was still up when she finally set down her pencil, which surprised her. He was sitting by the cold stove with a cup of something, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just keeping the lamp on. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you," he said. She sat down in the other chair. The house was quiet. Burl had gone home hours ago. The animals were settled. Outside the windows, the night was very dark, the kind of dark that felt total, that made the small circle of lamplight feel like something deliberate, something held against the larger dark on purpose. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I'm afraid of being wrong," she said. "Not about the documents. I know what the documents show. I'm afraid there's a piece I haven't seen, some mechanism I've missed, some angle the lawyers will find that makes what I've built look like something other than what it is." "It's not something other than what it is," he said. "I know that," she said. "I'm afraid the judge won't." He was quiet for a moment. "You said, back when this started, that one family's documents look like bad luck and two look like coincidence. How many do we have now?" "6 families," she said. 7 if you count the Prossers separately from the cross-county filing. "And Bryce has all of it." "Bryce has all of it." "Then you've done what you said you'd do," he said. "You built the case. Whatever the judge sees or doesn't see, you did what you said." She looked at him across the small kitchen, in the lamplight, in the quiet house. She thought about the morning she'd arrived in this yard in the back of a wagon, looking at the broken fence and the sagging barn roof and the tired man on the porch, counting what she could see and starting to assess what she was walking into. She thought about everything between that morning and this one. The evenings at this same table, the wagon rides and the document boxes, and the families who had each, in their own way, handed her something fragile and trusted her to carry it without breaking it. "Thank you," she said. For what exactly, she didn't specify. It covered too much for specifics. He nodded once. "Try to sleep," he said. She did, a little. When? The Dustfall County Courthouse had not been built for events of this kind. It was a modest building, 2 courtrooms, a clerk's office, a hallway that smelled of old wood and paper. Judge Nathaniel Crow had arrived the evening before with 2 clerks, and the county had scrambled to provide appropriate accommodation, which it had managed with varying success. Crow himself was not what Mara had imagined. She'd expected someone larger, somehow, or more formally imposing. He was a man in his early 60s, lean, with a short gray beard and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck. He moved through the room with an unhurried efficiency, shook hands with no one, sat down, put on his glasses, and looked at the papers in front of him. Varn was already there when they arrived. She hadn't seen him in person before. She'd seen his name on documents, heard him described. understood him as a presence and a mechanism. The actual man was both more ordinary and more unsettling than the idea of him. He was well-dressed, heavy through the middle, somewhere in his late 60s, with the particular ease of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in whatever room he entered. He had 2 lawyers with him, both of whom had the groomed, precise look of men brought in from outside the county. He looked at Mara when she came in. Not for long, just a look, quick and assessing. The look of a man seeing something he was prepared for and adjusting his existing assessment to account for the reality. Then he looked away. She found her seat at the plaintiff's table alongside Bryce, who had come from Harmon City and who greeted her with a brief professional nod. The families arranged themselves in the gallery. Elma and Tom Hart, Ruth Vale, the Colbys, Grady Shaw, who dressed better than she'd ever seen him, and who sat with his hands flat on his knees and his jaw set like a man facing something he'd been waiting too long to face. Jace sat beside her at the table. Crow looked up over his glasses. "We'll begin," he said. The opening was procedural. Filings, jurisdiction established, the nature of the complaint outlined in the formal language of federal review. Varn's senior lawyer, a man named Pettigrew, raised an immediate objection to jurisdiction that Crow heard in full and overruled in 4 sentences, 2 of which referenced the Prosser documents and the Alderton County connection. Mara kept her face neutral. Then Bryce presented the case. He was good at it, better than she'd expected from a man whose primary skill was administrative. He laid out the structural evidence clearly, using the timeline she'd built, moving through the clause analysis with the steady, unadorned confidence of a man presenting facts he was certain of. He called the cross-default mechanism what it was, a financial trap, without editorializing further, letting the documented evidence carry the description. Pettigrew objected several times. Crow noted the objections and continued. When Bryce reached the family testimonies, he called each family to speak in the order Mara had specified. Tom Hart first, with his ledger summary, his voice flat and precise and carrying no emotion except the specific emotion of a man laying out facts he'd been carrying for 6 years. Carrie Colby, whose plain account of the winter they'd paid down $400 and watched their balance rise, was the most affecting thing in the room, precisely because she delivered it without any attempt at affecting. Ruth Vale, who brought the original letter and read the 3rd paragraph aloud herself, in a voice that was entirely steady, and set it on the table in front of the judge. Pettigrew asked to cross-examine Ruth. Crow allowed it. Pettigrew was smooth. She'd expected that. He tried to establish that Ruth had misunderstood the letter's intent, that the language about cooperative parties referred to general procedural cooperation, not debt term manipulation. Ruth listened to the question and said simply, "My husband's lawyer understood it the same way I did. That's why he forwarded it to me with a note saying I probably didn't need to read it. When a lawyer tells you not to read something, you read it." There was a sound from the gallery that was almost laughter. Crow did not react. Pettigrew tried a different approach. "Mrs. Vale, are you a lawyer?" "No," she said. "A financial professional of any kind?" "No." "Then on what basis do you offer an interpretation of a legally complex document?" Ruth looked at him. "On the basis of being a person who reads," she said. "The 3rd paragraph isn't complex. It says what it says." Crow looked up from the letter which he'd been reading while the cross-examination proceeded. "I've read it," he said. "Proceed, counselor." Pettigrew proceeded. It didn't improve his position. Grady Shaw took the stand in the afternoon session. He had his records with him, the full 10 years organized in the sequence Mara had specified, which had required 2 conversations and 1 argument between them to arrive at. He looked at the judge with the focused intensity of a man who had been told too many times that he was wrong about something he was right about, and who had the documentation to prove it. Crow let him speak at length. That was the thing Mara noticed about the judge. He was not impatient. He asked questions that were specific and knowledgeable and that told her, more clearly than anything else, that he had read Bryce's filing thoroughly. He asked Grady to describe the March 1882 quarter increase in precise terms. He asked Tom Hart, recalled briefly, to confirm that his own March 1882 increase had occurred. He asked Bryce to pull the cross-reference chart from the filing and mark the page. Varn's lawyers objected to the chart as a derivative document, Crow noted the objection and then spent 15 minutes reading the supporting materials behind the chart before overruling it. Pettigrew made a final attempt in the late afternoon, calling Varn himself to address the structural argument. Varn spoke well, of course he did. He'd been managing perceptions for decades, framing the variable penalty clause as standard industry practice, the market adjustment provision as a reasonable protection against economic volatility, the cross-default mechanism as an obscure provision that had never, he claimed, been intentionally activated. Mara had been waiting for this. She passed Bryce a single page. He looked at it. She'd flagged it 2 days ago and told him it was for this moment. He stood. Your Honor, with respect to the claim that the cross-default mechanism was never intentionally activated, the complainant's documentation includes internal payment records from the Varn lending office obtained via the Prosser family, which show the same account referenced in the cross-default clause receiving regular quarterly transactions originating from an operating account registered in Mr. Varn's name. The mechanism was not triggered by external market events. It was triggered manually. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. It had a different density. Pettigrew was on his feet. Your Honor, that document was not— It's in the filing, Bryce said. Page 47? Crow was already turning to page 47. Varn at the defendant's table was very still, the specific stillness of a man recalculating. She watched it happen, the slight shift in his posture, the very small change in the quality of his attention. He'd been managing this hearing up until this moment from a position of basic confidence, not certainty. He was too experienced for certainty, but confidence, the kind that comes from years of watching systems contain whatever challenges arose. This was the moment that confidence left the room. It didn't leave dramatically. That was the thing about real moments. They rarely looked the way you imagined they would. Varn didn't break. He didn't react visibly. He leaned slightly toward Pettigrew and said something in a voice too low to hear, and Pettigrew's expression, which had been controlled all day, did something he hadn't quite intended it to do. Crow read page 47. Then he looked up. We'll recess until tomorrow morning, he said, at which time I'll have questions about the account documentation for both parties. The recess felt like being held underwater. They gathered that evening in the small boarding house at the end of Dust Falls Main Street, all the families, Bryce, Mara, and Jace, and ate a meal that nobody was particularly hungry for, and talked about the day in the subdued, careful way of people who didn't want to say what they were feeling in case saying it made it fragile. Grady ate a large amount of stew and said he thought it had gone well, which made Carrie Colby laugh slightly despite herself, which loosened something in the room. Ruth sat beside Mara and said quietly, Do you think he'll rule in our favor? I think he's read the documents, Mara said. I think he knows what they show. Beyond that, I don't know. That's an honest answer, Ruth said. It's the only one I have. Ruth was quiet for a moment. My husband used to say that honest answers are the only ones worth giving, even when they're not the ones people want. She paused. I didn't appreciate that as much when he was alive as I do now. Jace across the table caught Mara's eye. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She thought about what Ruth had said, about the shape of things, about how knowing what you're facing lets you stand correctly. She'd spent the past months so focused on the next step, the next document, the next conversation, that she'd barely allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they were actually doing. Now, sitting in this ordinary room with these ordinary people who'd handed her 6 years and 10 years of their private financial suffering and trusted her to do something with it, she felt it. It was heavy. It was also the opposite of unbearable. It was the kind of weight that had a purpose to it, and that made all the difference. Crow's ruling came on the morning of the second day, following 2 hours of targeted questioning that showed he'd spent the night reading every page of the filing. He directed most of the account questions at Pettigrew, who answered them with the careful precision of a man who knew the answers weren't going to help his client. The trigger account documentation was the center of it. The quarterly transactions, the registration in Varn's name, the dates that mapped precisely onto the cross-default activations across 6 family contracts. When Crow finished his questions, he removed his reading glasses and held them in his hand and looked at the room for a moment. I've reviewed the complete filing in this matter, he said. What the documentation describes is not a series of individual debt disputes. It is a coordinated system. The clauses in question appear in multiple contracts across 2 counties, in identical language placed in identical structural positions within documents that present different terms on their face. The trigger mechanism is not market responsive. It is manually controlled. The letter presented by Mrs. Vale establishes that the terms of these contracts were not fixed, as represented to the parties who signed them, but were adjustable based on factors entirely within the control of the lending party. Pettigrew began to rise. Crow held up one hand without looking at him. The court finds that the documentation supports a finding of systematic financial fraud. This court is ordering an immediate freeze on all contracts originating from Varn's lending office pending a full federal audit. The families named in this complaint are hereby released from the penalty provisions of their contracts pending that audit. I am further referring the matter of criminal liability to the federal prosecutor's office. He put his glasses back on. This is not a close case. He looked at the room one more time, at the families in the gallery, at Varn at his table, at Mara, and then looked back at his papers. "We're adjourned," he said. The sound that came from the gallery was not a cheer. It was quieter than that, more like the sound of breath being released, of tension leaving bodies that had been holding it for years. Elma Hart pressed both hands flat against the table in front of her. Tom put his arm around her. Carrie Colby put her face in her hands, not crying exactly, but close to it. The complicated physical response of relief arriving in a body that had been prepared for disappointment. Grady sat for a moment without moving. Then he stood up very slowly, the way a man stands up when his legs are older than he'd like them to be, and looked at Mara across the room. He nodded once. That was all. She nodded back. Ruth Vale stood and smoothed her skirt and picked up her bag and looked at Mara with an expression that was too full for a single name. "Thank you," she said. "You brought the letter," Mara said. "You kept it all this time." "I didn't know what I was keeping it for," Ruth said. "Now I do." Varn left quickly, between his lawyers, without looking at anyone. She noticed that. Not the leaving. She'd expected that, but the particular quality of it. He'd spent decades as the man everyone watched, the man whose attention mattered, the heaviest presence in any room. And he left this one looking at the floor, which was its own kind of verdict. Pettigrew paused near the plaintiff's table on his way out. He looked at Mara for a moment and seemed about to say something, then thought better of it. She watched him go. Bryce shook her hand formally and said the audit would take several months, that the criminal referral would move on its own timeline, that she'd receive formal notification of each step. She thanked him and meant it. Then the room cleared, and it was just her and Jace and the families standing in the ordinary, slightly dusty courtroom in the ordinary small town at the edge of nowhere, and the morning light was coming in through the east windows the way it always did, without any awareness of what had just happened inside. Ticked. The months that followed were not simple. The audit took 4 months. The criminal proceedings, which began 6 weeks after the hearing, were slow and complicated and involved lawyers and counterfilings and procedural delays that required a specific kind of patience to endure. Varn's lawyers were very good at delays. The freeze on contracts held despite 2 attempts to lift it, both of which Bryce's office contested and won. Criminal charges were formally filed in the 4th month. Fraud. 11 counts. 3 of them carried the weight of the Alderton County connection, which was the federal charge that couldn't be reduced or negotiated away. Mara followed all of it on paper, say. The notices arrived at the Mallory Ranch, which had become, by a gradual and unremarked process, the coordination point for everything. The address where correspondence went, where families sent updates, where Bryce's office directed documentation requests. She answered every letter. She kept the record current. She helped the Colbys navigate the audit process when they didn't understand what was being asked of them, helped Ruth submit the additional documentation the federal office required, helped Grady not send an unsolicited letter to the prosecutor's office expressing his personal opinions about the case, which took 2 full conversations. The audit found what she expected it to find. The cross-default trigger accounts were shell accounts. 2 of them, registered in subsidiary names that traced back through 2 layers of corporate registration to Varn directly. They'd been activated in the first quarter of each year manually for 8 consecutive years. The mechanism had worked on 11 families across 2 counties. 6 of those families were part of the Dustfall complaint. The other 5 were identified through the audit, and their contracts were frozen as well. When she read that in the official notification, she sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and thought about Aldous on the boardwalk, saying if it takes too long, they'll wear down. She thought about the 5 families who hadn't come forward, who hadn't known anyone was looking, who were now, through no action of their own, included in the protection. There was something important in that. She turned it over for a long time. The thing about a system of isolation, she thought, was that it only worked when people stayed isolated. The mechanism Varn had built was elegant precisely because it was invisible, because each family experienced it as their own private failure, their own private shame, the evidence of their own inadequacy. As long as they stayed separate, the pattern stayed hidden. As long as they believed they were alone in it, they couldn't see that they weren't alone in it. What she and Jace and the families had done wasn't complex at its core. They'd compared notes. They'd looked at the same thing from multiple angles simultaneously and recognized that what looked like individual bad luck from inside each family looked, from outside, like a design. That was it. That was the whole thing. Not brilliance, not heroism, just the stubborn refusal to stay separate. Clem Kincaid's situation was addressed in the audit's 7th week. His debt to Varn's office was among those identified as carrying the manipulated penalty clauses. The transfer agreement, the document that had delivered Mara to the Mallory Ranch, was deemed invalid as a derivative of a fraudulent debt structure. She received the formal notification on a Tuesday and read it twice and then put it down on the kitchen table and didn't pick it up again for several hours. She went out to the north pasture and stood at the fence for a while, looking at the cattle in the better grass, thinking about her father at the kitchen table not looking at her, thinking about the morning on the wagon, thinking about all the space between that morning and this one. She was free. Officially, formally, documentedly free. Not collateral, not property. Not a line item in someone else's accounting. She didn't feel the way she'd imagined she'd feel. She felt tired, mostly, in the way you feel tired after a long, sustained effort when the effort finally ends, and your body catches up to what it's been spending. And she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, though there was that too, but something more like orientation, like a compass needle settling. She went back inside and wrote her father a letter. Not about the legal resolution, that would come in its own correspondence through official channels. Just a letter. The first one she'd written him since leaving. She told him she was all right. She told him the situation was being addressed. She told him not to sign anything, which she'd been telling him for months through various intermediaries. And she told him she'd be coming to see him, though she didn't say when, because she didn't know yet. She didn't tell him she'd forgiven him, because she hadn't, entirely. Forgiveness, she was finding, wasn't a decision you made once. It was something you came back to repeatedly, in small increments, over a long time. She was working on it. In the 5th month, Varn entered into a plea arrangement that avoided the full trial, but resulted in a suspended sentence, substantial fines, and the dissolution of his lending operations. It was less than Grady thought he deserved, which he expressed at length to Mara over a fence one afternoon, and she agreed with him in private while noting that the dissolution of the operations and the recovery of the fraudulently extracted funds was the material outcome that mattered most to the families who were still alive and still on their land. Grady said that was a very reasonable way to look at it. She said she knew. He said he didn't have to like it. She said nobody was asking him to. He grunted, and they both leaned on the fence for a while looking at the neighboring pastures, and the afternoon was warm and the land was very quiet. The winter that year was milder than the one before it, which Burl observed was probably too good to last, which was probably true. The north pasture had been properly rotated, and the cattle had benefited. 2 of the fence sections Mara had flagged in her first week were fully rebuilt, not just repaired. The barn roof, the sagging side, was fixed in October by Jason Burl over a long weekend that involved significant effort, some creative problem-solving with the available timber, and one moment where Burl said something from the ridge beam that made Jace laugh out loud, which was a sound Mara had noticed she was hearing more often. She was still at the ranch. This had not been announced or decided in any formal sense. The transfer agreement had been invalidated. Her legal obligation was gone. She was free to leave, and Jace had told her so explicitly, in the direct way he'd developed for important things, standing in the kitchen one evening with the notification letter in his hand. "You don't owe me anything anymore," he'd said. "You don't owe this place anything." I know, she'd said. So if you want to go, I know, she'd said again. I'll let you know when I decide. She'd decided, without making a production of it, to stay through the winter. And then the winter had settled in, and the work had its rhythm, and she'd stopped thinking about it as a decision she was revisiting and started thinking about it as simply where she was. She visited her father in November, drove out to the Kincaid property on a clear, cold morning and sat at the kitchen table she'd grown up at, and drank coffee and looked at the man across from her who was older than she'd remembered and smaller than she'd remembered, and who met her eyes this time, which he hadn't been able to do the last time. He asked her what was going to happen to the farm. She told him his debt had been restructured under the audit, that what remained was a fraction of what he'd owed, the legitimate original principal without the manufactured accumulations. He'd be able to work it down. It would take time, but it was workable. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm sorry, Mara. She looked at him, at the lines in his face, the gray in his hair, the way the light came through the kitchen window the same as it always had, landing on the same table in the same slant it had landed on her whole life. I know you are, she said. That's not enough, he said. I know it's not enough. No, she said. It's not. She looked at her coffee. But it's a start. They sat together for another hour. When she left, she hugged him at the door, which neither of them had done in years, and he held on for a moment before letting go. She drove back to the Mallory Ranch through the cold, clear afternoon and thought about things you can't fix and things you can, and the inexact, ongoing work of telling the difference. Spring came back to Dustfall the way it always did. Not gently, not dramatically, but practically. The ground softened. The grass came in on the north pasture where it was supposed to come in now because it had been managed correctly through the winter. The fence held. The barn roof held. The cattle were in better condition than they'd been the spring before, which Burl noted with the same approving grunt he used for most satisfactory developments. Mara was repairing the kitchen garden fence when Jace came out of the barn and stopped in the yard and watched her work for a moment. You know you don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, driving a post with the mallet she'd taken from the barn without asking, which she'd stopped asking permission for months ago. The gate's been dragging since fall. I was going to fix it. Were you? He watched her work. She could feel him deciding something. I want to ask you something, he said. She kept working. Ask? What you said. Back on the road from Harmon City, the first time. About what comes after. He paused. Have you thought about it? She drove the last post, checked the gate, swung it once to test the hang. It moved cleanly. She set down the mallet and turned to look at him. She had thought about it. She'd thought about it through the winter, through the audit and the letters and the visits to families and the slow unwinding of the case, thought about it in the way you think about something you're not ready to look at directly, and so approach from angles, in pieces, in the small hours. She'd thought about what she wanted, which she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a long time, years maybe, because wanting things she couldn't control had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. What she'd arrived at was this, that she didn't know exactly what the future looked like, and that for the first time in a long time, not knowing didn't feel like a threat. It felt like space. It felt like the difference between a life that was all damage control and a life that might, if you paid attention, be about something else as well. I've thought about it, she said. He waited. I'd like to stay, she said. Not because of the legal situation, and not because I don't have anywhere else to go, because I do. I'd like to stay because I want to. She paused. If that's something you want too. He looked at her for a moment. The morning light was coming in flat and clear from the east, catching the dust in the yard and the fence posts and the ordinary working surface of the land. He didn't say anything elegant. He wasn't a man who found his way to elegant. He just looked at her and said, Yeah, it is. She picked up the mallet. He came over and looked at the gate. You hung it right, he said. I know, she said. They went in for breakfast. The families of Dustfall County didn't stop being neighbors the way they'd been before. Cautious, self-contained, each holding their particular trouble alone. But they weren't quite the same neighbors they'd been either. Something had changed that couldn't fully change back. They knew each other now. Not just knew of each other, not just recognized names and faces at the county seat. They knew each other's debts and fears and the specific quality of each family's stubbornness, which was different in each case and which had, in combination, amounted to something none of them could have managed alone. Elma Hart organized a quarterly meeting, which she announced without asking anyone if they wanted it, just told them when and where, which was exactly the right approach for Elma. The first one was awkward. The second was less so. By the third, people were bringing things, questions, problems, disputes they didn't understand, and the group was working through them together with the specific competence of people who'd learned that collective knowledge is harder to manipulate than individual ignorance. Mara came to the first meeting and left the subsequent ones to run themselves, which they mostly did. That was, she thought, the point. Not a thing that required her to keep holding it up, but a thing that could hold itself. She thought sometimes, in the quiet of the ranch, about what it actually takes to build something that lasts. Not just to fix a crisis, but to leave something behind that keeps working when you're not watching it. You couldn't do it alone. That was the first thing. Whatever you thought you could manage by yourself, you couldn't, and the belief that you could was the lever that people like Varn used against you. The isolation wasn't incidental to the scheme. It was the scheme. Break the isolation and the scheme unraveled almost on its own. But breaking the isolation required trust, and trust required something to trust toward, some shared interest large enough to outweigh the fear. The families of Dustfall had found that interest in their shared destruction. Better, obviously, to find it before the destruction. But people, she thought, mostly don't. People mostly need to be in the problem before they can see the shape of it. That wasn't a comfortable truth. She held it anyway because comfortable wasn't the standard, she held truths too. 2 years after the hearing, Varn's former lending office building on the main street of Dustfall was rented by a hardware supplier. The sign came down one Tuesday morning while Mara was in town posting letters, and she stopped and watched two men take it down and carry it away and lean it against the side of the building while the new tenant figured out where to put it. Just a sign. Just a building. Just a Tuesday morning in a small town going about its ordinary business. She walked on. Jace was waiting at the wagon with flour and seed orders from the dry goods store. He handed her the paper sack and looked at her expression and said, "What?" "They took down Varn's sign," she said. He looked down the block at the building, back at her. "Hardware place now looks like," he said. "Yeah," she said. They drove home through the spring afternoon, through the land that was dry in some places and green in others, and entirely indifferent to human plans, the way land is. The ranch came into view as they turned up the approach road. The rebuilt fence, the solid barn, the kitchen garden she'd extended in the fall, Burl's horse at the rail, smoke from the stove. It looked, she thought, like a place that was going to be all right. Not perfect, not finished. A working ranch is never finished. The work just changes shape from season to season. Not free of hard years, because hard years were the country's nature and always would be, but a place with a foundation under it, a place that knew what it was, a place where the people inside it had chosen to be inside it rather than been trapped there by circumstance. That was enough. More than enough. She climbed down from the wagon and went inside and put the flour away and started on supper. And the afternoon light moved through the kitchen windows the way light does when it has nowhere particular to be. Long and quiet and easy. And outside the land stretched in every direction to the horizon. It didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like somewhere to begin.